Who was the only president elected to more than 2 terms? Answer: Franklin D. Roosevelt. The 22nd Amendment, setting a 2-term limit for presidents, was enacted after Roosevelt was elected to office for the 4th time. It formalized a tradition started by George Washington, who refused to run for a 3rd term in 1796. The amendment, ratified in 1951, states, quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once." Who was the only president to be elected to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office? Answer: Grover Cleveland. Cleveland won the 1884 election but was ousted in the 1888 contest by Benjamin Harrison. 4 years later, in 1892, the man known as Old Vito was back. Cleveland's 2nd term was plagued by an economic crisis referred to as the Panic of 1893 and labor unrest. He failed to win back his party's confidence for a 3rd nomination. Who was the first presidential candidate to have news of his nomination telegraphed? Answer: James Polk. News of Polk's nomination in May of 1844 was telegraphed from Baltimore, the site of the convention, to Washington, D.C. This was the first use of the newly invented telegraph to disseminate such information. However, back in Tennessee, Polk himself did not learn of his nomination until several days later. Which president was elected only after a legal battle that went to the Supreme Court? Answer: George W. Bush. In the 2000 election between Bush and Al Gore, the results from 49 states failed to produce the 270 electoral votes needed for either candidate to declare victory, leaving Florida's voters to decide who would get that state's 25 electoral votes and win the national election. Although Bush initially seemed to have the lead in Florida, the popular vote was so close that Gore demanded a recount. There were also reports of voting irregularities, such as poorly designed ballots that confused voters, hanging chads on punch cards that made it difficult to divine the voters' intent, which created more havoc. Ultimately, it was up to the Supreme Court to decide if a recount should go forward. Weeks later, the court ruled a statewide recount unconstitutional, concluding that it would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and Bush was declared the winner. Which war hero was solicited by both Democratic and Republican parties to run for president? Answer: Dwight Eisenhower. The supreme commander of the Allied expeditionary forces in World War II was one of the most esteemed figures in America after victory in 1945. Both parties saw him as a winner and tried to woo him into the presidential race in 1948, but he declined and voted Republican for Dewey. The pressure on him to run mounted again in 1952, and this time he went with the Republicans, winning the nomination on the first ballot. Who was the first presidential candidate to appear on MTV? Answer: Bill Clinton. In 1992, Democratic candidate Clinton visited the music video channel MTV to tape a special program aimed at young voters called Choose or Lose. During the filming, audience members had an opportunity to ask Clinton questions, some of them fairly direct. Quote, "If you had to do it all over again, would you inhale?" One youthful questioner asked in reference to Clinton's prior marijuana use. Clinton managed to finesse the response and went on to win the election, crediting MTV with bringing votes to the ticket of Clinton and Al Gore. Who was the only president never actually elected to either the office of president or vice president? Answer: Gerald Ford. The 38th president never expected to work in the Oval Office. His first promotion came when Richard Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned amid a bribery scandal in 1973. Nixon chose Ford to take Agnew's place. A year later, Nixon was in hot water for conducting a cover-up of the Watergate scandal. He resigned from the presidency in disgrace, leaving Ford to take over the reins of the government. Who is the only president to have been elected by unanimous electoral vote? Answer: George Washington. No one can top Washington's record. In his first election, he got all 69 electoral votes from the 10 states that cast them. Then the father of our country, who still enjoyed preeminent status as a hero of the Revolutionary War, did it again in 1792, winning all 132 electoral votes and all 15 states. Washington had an advantage over his successors in that there was not yet a two-party system in America, so he faced little opposition. Which presidential campaign used surplus military material to promote its candidate? Answer: Dwight Eisenhower's. The 1956 Eisenhower bandwagon campaign employed jeeps, barrage balloons, and other material associated with the heroic five-star general to promote the candidate. Painted with the slogans, "I like Ike," or simply Ike, in red and white, the items could not fail to impress citizens who saw the pageantry of war turned into a parade of peace. Accompanying the campaign caravan as it made its way around the country were festive troops of local girls wearing Ike dresses and carrying Ike parasols. Which president's inaugural speech may have killed him? Answer: William Henry Harrison. Harrison recited 8,445 words in a speech that may have literally cost him his life. It was a chilly March day in the capital city, and the president stood outside without hat, gloves, or coat. Later, he was walking and got caught in a downpour. Soon, he came down with a cold that turned into pneumonia. His last words were, "I wish you to understand the true principles of government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." Recent analysis by medical experts has cast doubt on this popular version of Harrison's death, with many commentators questioning whether a cold contracted on March 4th could lead to a death a full month later. Records seem to indicate that Harrison contracted a second cold on March 28th, which quickly turned into pneumonia and led to his death on April 4th. Certainly, Harrison's reckless disregard for the weather contributed to his demise. Who was the first president to take the oath in Washington, D.C.? Answer: Thomas Jefferson. After one of the most contentious elections in history, Jefferson took the oath on March 4, 1801, in the unfinished Capitol building in Washington, D.C. According to a report in the Alexandria Times, Jefferson wore the clothes, quote, "of a plain citizen without any distinct badge or of office, rather than donning an elegant suit or uniform. Instead of taking a coach, he walked to the packed Senate chamber and delivered his speech in a barely audible voice before taking the oath administered by Chief Justice John Marshall at the clerk's desk. Jefferson's second inauguration in 1805 featured the first inaugural parade. Which president was the first to be sworn in on live television? Answer: Harry Truman. Coverage of Truman's inaugural on live television made it the most widely viewed single event of its time. An estimated 10 million Americans saw the swearing in of the 33rd president. Truman's 1949 inaugural was full of firsts. It marked the debut of the current presidential seal of the United States. It was the first openly racially integrated inaugural in modern times, and it was the most expensive and elaborate inauguration to that date, including the grandstand, gala, and fireworks.